Good evening. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at a congressional exchange that many expected to be a reckoning, but instead became something else entirely. A moment meant to clarify the facts behind one of the most consequential investigations in modern American politics that ended up exposing just how fragile public confidence has become. At the center of it all, Jack Smith, the man tasked with investigating former President Donald Trump. And across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett, delivering not just questions, but a narrative. What unfolded wasn't a debate over evidence alone. It was a confrontation over power, authority, and whether the special counsel's role itself has become part of the political story.
Can I get an extra 33 seconds?
You get your full 5 minutes.
Well, okay, fine. It's curious because you've sat here all day, and thank you so much for showing up, because this was something that you wanted to do. The Republicans wanted to make sure that you were hid in a room with no cameras, because I was there. They didn't really want you out public because they were afraid of what you would say, which is that you could have proven your case because you are a career prosecutor who knows how to prosecute criminals. So just to be clear, today, it seems like the Republicans have not really fought very much about whether or not Trump was guilty or not. In fact, their fight seems to be over whether or not you were authorized to prove their guilt. Do you recall a number of Republican members asking about whether or not your appointment was okay, even though we know that you've testified about the more than 100-year precedent that allowed for your appointment?
I was asked questions about that today, and our position, as we filed in our appeal, is that there was strong support for my appointment, including Supreme Court precedent directly on point.
Thank you so much. Additionally, everybody's been all gingerly here today, but I don't know why we're acting surprised that a man who had close to 90 allegations out of 4 different jurisdictions and ultimately ended up with 34 convictions after a jury was able to hear all the evidence would possibly be committing a criminal act on January 6th. In fact, considering the fact that we are now under the impression that he is violating people's due process rights, he is ignoring court orders, he's starting wars without congressional authority in contradiction to the Constitution. He's enriching himself to the tune of over $1.4 billion. He's shaking down electeds to draw maps that will help him stay in power because the Republicans don't understand that they swore an oath to the Constitution and that we are supposed to do checks and balances. He's also shaking down TV stations to get money. So why are we trying to pretend as if it is out of the realm for this particular man to commit the crime that he committed on January 6th, and frankly, the only reason he ran for president was to make sure that he would not be prosecuted, because I fully believe that you would have put him under the jail based on our long-form conversation that we had. But according to your special counsel report on page 137, it states the department's view that the Constitution prohibits the continued indictment and prosecution of a president is categorical and does not turn on the gravity of the crimes charged, the strength of the government's proof, or the merits of the prosecution. And that, quote, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. In other words, Donald Trump ran for president, like I said, so he wouldn't have to spend the rest of his life in prison. The chairman and other members of this committee have spent all day attacking you and trying to rewrite the history of January 6th. But Mr. Jim Jordan, the chairman, failed to mention how he was running around the Capitol terrified by the possibility that all those insurrectionists would harm him. In fact, on page 97 of the deposition transcript, you mentioned how Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff, quote unquote, never saw Jim Jordan so scared. The chairman also failed to mention that he was in direct contact with the White House in the days leading up to and on January 6th, which is why his toll records were subpoenaed by your office. Let me be clear, because they're trying to act like this is Democrats on Republicans, and I guess you are a covert Democrat that knew that he was going to try to steal an election before he tried to steal that election, and so therefore you were somehow put into place. I mean, the conspiracy theories make your head spin, but nevertheless, were you going to subpoena the toll records of every single Republican simply because they were a Republican?
No. We subpoenaed the toll records in the course of this investigation because they were relevant to our investigation.
Relevant? Oh, okay. All right, so that means something about facts. So let's talk about facts. Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, yes or no?
That's correct.
Okay. In fact, 60 federal and state courts have found that there was no evidence of election fraud. Trump's own attorney general and vice president knew that he lost the election, but he still tried to steal the election by pressuring state officials, designing fake elector plans, nearly having Mike Pence hanged, and ultimately demanding that his supporters, quote, fight like hell, correct?
Correct.
We all saw it happen we all saw what happened once they reached the U.S. Capitol. As your report outlines, President Trump knew that he would incite violence at the Capitol that day. In fact, some of Trump's senior advisors were pushing for violence. For example, page 81 of the report details how co-conspirators number 2, John Eastman, tried to convince Mike Pence to break the law, stating that, quote, violence was necessary. So it isn't just Trump who is responsible for the death of multiple law enforcement officers and the injuries of thousands of people. A lot of Republican members of Congress are also responsible. 147 Republicans voted to overturn the 2020 election results, including multiple members currently serving on this committee, and I will yield.
From the start, the focus wasn't whether Trump committed crimes, but whether Jack Smith had the right to pursue them at all. Smith defended his appointment by citing long-standing Justice Department practice and Supreme Court precedent. He emphasized that his authority was lawful, tested, and consistent with history, but critics argue that this is precisely the problem. Instead of allowing a full judicial process to play out, Smith's role has become entangled with constitutional gray zones, particularly around prosecuting a former president who is now once again a political candidate. The question hanging in the room wasn't simply is he authorized, but should this authority exist without clearer guardrails? In moments like these, legal precedent may answer the court, but it does not always answer the public. Representative Crockett framed Smith as a neutral career prosecutor, someone Republicans allegedly feared because he could prove his case. But that framing itself drew backlash. Critics point out that Smith's own report contains a striking admission that prosecution was halted not because of weak evidence, but because of constitutional constraints tied to Trump's presidency. That admission has fueled skepticism. To some observers, it suggests that the investigation crossed from fact-finding into assumption, where guilt is implied, but accountability is deferred. Others argue it reveals a system where timing, not justice, determines outcomes. And that raises a dangerous question. If a prosecutor publicly signals confidence in conviction without trial, does that strengthen trust or undermine it? Crockett pushed aggressively on January 6th, citing court rulings, election losses, and Trump's rhetoric. She also expanded responsibility beyond Trump, naming advisors like John Eastman and members of Congress who objected to certification. But critics of Smith argue that his investigation has blurred lines between criminal liability and political association. Subpoenas, phone records, and broad investigative scope have led some to ask, was this a narrowly tailored criminal probe or a sweeping inquiry that risks criminalizing political behavior? Smith insisted subpoenas were issued based on relevance, not party. Still, the perception remains. When investigations grow wide enough, neutrality becomes harder to prove. By the end of the exchange, one thing was clear: Jack Smith did not lose his composure. He remained measured, careful, legalistic, but he also did little to resolve the core concern. Whether the special counsel system is now being asked to carry political weight it was never designed to bear. Supporters see Smith as the firewall protecting the rule of law. Critics see a prosecutor whose authority, timing, and public posture risk deepening mistrust rather than restoring confidence. And that may be the real story tonight, not whether Donald Trump is guilty, not whether January 6th was serious, but whether Americans can still believe that justice is being administered above politics rather than through it. Because when faith in the referee collapses, the outcome of the game no longer matters. We'll continue to follow this story